Of the many reasons people love horror movies, right at the top of the list is getting to see some creatively nasty kills, because what card-carrying horror fan doesn't love a gory death scene or two? But as cinema has proven time and time again, what we're not shown can end up having a far more bruising, lasting impact, as is most certainly the case with the following movie deaths. In each of these scenes, the pivotal moment of death was obscured from view or cut away from. Perhaps it was for budgetary reasons, but it nevertheless left audiences to imagine precisely what happened and what the poor victim was going through in their final moments. While it can be disappointing for audiences to be robbed of the desired money shot, in each of these scenes, the implication probably ended up being so much worse, effectively weaponizing our own imaginations against us. I'm Sean Ferrick for What Culture Horror, and here are 10 what the f off-screen horror movie deaths. Number 10, Marlena, Cloverfield. Nobody suffers a more agonizing death in Cloverfield than Marlena, who midway through the film is bitten by one of the smaller parasitic creatures which falls off the main monster attacking New York City. This leaves Marlena increasingly weak until she starts bleeding from the eyes, causing the military personnel in the vicinity to start panicking and drag her to a quarantine area. Though we don't directly witness what happens to Marlena, we do get to see a silhouette of her grisly end as her body rapidly expands and violently bursts open, splattering blood all over the nearby tarp and killing her instantly. Even though we understand the basic beats of what happened, not explicitly seeing it only ends up making her death that much more unsettling, even if it was most likely concealed due to budgetary constraints, given the technical complexity of showing such an elaborate death in clear view. Number 9. Saskia, The Vanishing. 1988's Dutch horror thriller The Vanishing presents a tantalizing mystery as a man, Rex, investigates the disappearance of his girlfriend Saskia from a French service station. 3 years after Saskia's baffling disappearance, Rex remains dangerously obsessed with learning the truth and is eventually contacted by the man responsible, Raymond. In the climax, Raymond eventually promises to reveal Saskia's fate to Rex, but only if he agrees to go through the same experience. So Raymond pours Rex a cup of drugged coffee and encourages him to drink it, which in his anguished desperation to know what happened, he does. And then comes the horrifying ending. Rex wakes up buried alive in a coffin, left to die just like Saskia was, while Raymond returns to his family and gets away with his heinous acts. Number 8. Lambert Alien. Ridley Scott's Alien is a masterpiece of subtlety and suspense, and perhaps its most disturbing death scene is the ambiguous yet undeniably horrific demise of Nostromo crew member Lambert. The xenomorph gets the drop on Lambert while she's gathering coolant in the bowels of the ship, and the sight of the creature simply leaves her paralyzed with fear as it corners her. But rather than make short work of Lambert, we see the alien slowly approach and curl its tail up her body, a stomach-churning visual which many have suggested implies the xenomorph sexually violated Lambert before killing her. Either way, Scott cuts away at this point, leaving us to only hear Lambert's dying screams as Ripley frantically heads to her position. And when Ripley finally makes it there, we see only Lambert's bare legs suspended in the air, suggesting the xenomorph both left her hanging from the rafters and inexplicably stripped her in the process of killing her. The vague implications of all of this are so much more unsettling than had Scott actually shown it in graphic detail. Number 7. Mika, Paranormal Activity. Found footage classic Paranormal Activity climaxes with the death of Mika at the hands of his demonically possessed partner Katie, and like the rest of the movie, it derives enormous suspense from what it doesn't show us. On the film's final night, Katie gets out of bed, creepily stares at Mika for 2 hours, and then heads downstairs. Soon enough, she lets out a blood-curdling scream, naturally prompting an alarmed Mika to rush downstairs to her aid. However, once he makes it downstairs, we hear Mika scream in pain, followed by the thuds that sound like somebody walking up the stairs. At that moment, Mika's dead body is then thrown at the camera by a possessed Katie before she disappears into the night and the film ends. While it doesn't take much imagination to consider what happened to Mika, for anyone who's ever gone downstairs in the middle of the night after hearing a concerning sound, it's a deeply eerie ending, especially as we only see the aftermath of the fate that befell him in his own home. The brilliance was arguably undermined a tad, however, by spin-off Paranormal Activity The Marked Ones, which, through timey-wimey shenanigans, actually showed Katie stabbing Mika to death. For everyone who's seen this movie, y'all know he deserved it, right? Number 6. Paula, Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives. Friday the 13th is hardly a franchise where the audience expects the filmmakers to artfully cut away from a grisly death scene, because after all, the meat and potatoes of the series has always been its creatively bloody death scenes. So fans were left scratching their heads in Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives, when sweet Paula gets turned into human paint by Jason Voorhees. Paula is caught off guard in her cabin by Jason, But rather than show Jason slashing her up with a machete, director Tom McLoughlin instead cuts away, ensuring we can only see an admittedly massive splash of blood from outside the cabin's window before Jason slams Paula's corpse through said window. When Sheriff Garris enters the cabin a few moments later, we see blood everywhere, making it clear that Jason did something incredibly depraved to Paula, far in excess of simply cutting her up and moving on. It's one of the messiest, grossest kills in the entire series, and the ambiguity regarding what Jason actually did continues to fascinate fans almost 40 years on. Number 5. Gage Creed, Pet Sematary. Most horror movies are shy of showing child death, but the original 1989 Pet Sematary adaptation did a masterful job of making the grisly unseen details so much more upsetting. The story takes a wild turn when the Creed family's adorable young son Gage runs out onto a busy road where he's struck and instantly killed by a tanker truck. Yet rather than show Gage get creamed by the truck, director Mary Lambert goes the more tasteful route by simply showing Gage's bloody shoe catapulting across the pavement, followed by the wreckage of the truck and Gage's father Lewis screaming in a grief-stricken rage. Needless to say, this was decidedly more effective than had we simply seen Gage get pureed, focusing instead on the innocence tragically lost, exemplified by some heartbreaking Polaroid shots of Gage as a baby being embraced by his parents. Brutal isn't even the word. Though 2019's remake made some divisive changes to this sequence, it nevertheless took the same approach to filming the pivotal child death, leaving audiences to imagine the impact in their own minds. Number 4. Bernadette, Handyman, 1992. Here's an amazingly horrifying death scene that isn't talked about nearly enough by horror fans. Later in the film, protagonist Helen's pal Bernadette arrives at her apartment while Handyman is in the middle of tormenting her. Knowing what's about to happen, a wounded Helen tries to tell Bernadette to leave, but it's too late. She enters the apartment and is immediately set upon by Handyman. At the moment of Bernadette's death, however, director Bernard Rose cuts away, leaving us only to hear her all-timer of a blood-curdling scream, accompanied by the revolting sounds of her flesh being torn apart by Candyman's hook, and Candyman grunting from the effort of ripping her body asunder. And because this isn't quite enough, we do get a brief glimpse of Bernadette's corpse, and to call it a bloody mess is quite the understatement indeed. Number 3. Mrs. Delusio, Sinister. Horror hit Sinister is undeniably best remembered for its brilliantly disturbing scenes of tapes which depict the murders of entire families, courtesy of the pagan Babylonian god Bagul. And though the other tapes show the deaths of the families in agonizing, painstaking fashion, for the tape entitled Lawn Work 86, director Scott Derrickson decides to spare us the gnarly money shot. The tape in question shows one of the victims, Mrs. Delusio, having her head run over by a lawnmower. But just as the mower approaches, Derrickson strategically cuts away to Ellison Oswald reacting to the horrifying scream on the film. It's one of the genre's most memorable jump scares of the last decade plus, and while we all love a gory death scene, in this case, the implication of what happened to Mrs. Delusio was certainly worse than any elaborate squib effect we could have been shown. The grimy Super 8 cinematography combined with the outstandingly eerie musical score and evocative sound design is doing all the work here. Number 2. Katie, The Ring. The surprisingly great American remake of The Ring might just lay claim to the most disturbing off-screen death scene in any PG-13 horror movie, beginning as it does with the demise of ill-fated Katie, who viewed the cursed ring tape a week prior to the start of the movie. At the moment that Katie is killed by antagonist Samara, director Gore Verbinski cuts away just as she lets out a scream, and a few scenes later we're shown a quick glimpse of Katie's nauseatingly disfigured corpse as it's discovered by her soon-to-be traumatized mother. The audience is simply left to ponder how the curse made Katie look like this, and crucially, the movie never tips its hand and reveals precisely how Samara does this to her victims, of which Katie sure isn't the last. That pallid, twisted face is imprinted on the brain of anyone who's seen this movie. Pure, uncut nightmare fuel. Number 1, Nurse Keating, The Exorcist 3. Though wildly polarizing upon release, The Exorcist 3 certainly gets a good deal more love these days, and nobody who's seen it can forget that scene where Nurse Keating gets decapitated with a pair of shears. The entire setup with this gnarly payoff is masterful, lingering on a seemingly unremarkable shot of hospital hallway where Nurse Keating enters a room, does her checks, and then re-emerges to lock the room up. But as she turns around, the door suddenly pulls open, and a nun carrying shears quickly pursues her, accompanied by one of the horror genre's all-time most pant-filling jump scare sound effects. Before the fatal snip can be made, though, we cut to a decapitated statue of Jesus Christ, making it abundantly clear the fate that's befallen the nurse without actually having to show her head being parted from her body on camera. Cheerful,